Hey guys, welcome to the last session, session 8 of the Impact Cohort Series, Good Shepherding. I'm Warren Maynard, the Executive Director of Impact Players. With me for our final session, Shiju Jacob, Lead Elder of Selma Eastside Church in Issaquah, Washington. Shiju, welcome and thank you for being a part of this series with us.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
Well, despite all the leadership training and resources available today, we still face a leadership crisis across various sectors of our culture. Today, we'll be discussing shepherding practices for your organization and the importance of replicating ourselves as leaders, multiplying our impact, and shepherding practices for organizations. Shiju, I'd love to hear about your journey and the ways that you've learned leadership in your life and career, and maybe share some of those experiences with us.
Well, as I've shared in a few sessions ago, probably the first time I really learned to aspire for leadership was on the basketball court as a teenager. And so that was probably the first time. But I think when I became a Christian, it was around that time. And as I was getting discipled at 18, that's really when I started to see what else is out there for me. Like what is life all about? And what am I capable of? And every Christian has at least one spiritual gift. Some of them are, in Ephesians 4:11 is the acronym APEST: apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, teachers. We have, and then 1 Corinthians 12 and 13, there's a whole list of other spiritual gifts. There's a lot of spiritual gifts that we have, but every Christian has at least one. And I think that when I became a believer, the spiritual gift of leadership started to come out. I don't know if I had that gift before I became a convert. No one called me a leader growing up. Maybe my sister did, because I have a little sister.
Yeah.
But when I started following...
I think she probably called you a jerk.
That too, yeah. But not anymore, though. I've changed. So, I think that's kind of how it all began.
Yeah.
And I think God used those gifts of leadership and even teaching and administration to be demonstrated both in the local church and in the marketplace. It was those gifts that got me a job, not my degrees. My degrees are in Bible and counseling. Wow. And I ended up in the corporate world because of my spiritual gifts, I think. Leadership, administration, teaching.
Yeah. So you have some of those gifts that were just drawn out of you through sports, through some other leadership positions. Did you take time to try to study leadership? How did you develop a philosophy or approach to leadership as you were beginning that career?
Yeah. When I was beginning my career in the workforce, the guide for leadership were the people in my life. And my first boss, her name was Lisa Seeger. She's maybe 4'11", 60 years old, and she was the greatest boss I've ever had. I mean, she demonstrated a level of care for me that was reproducible, that I could demonstrate toward my direct reports as I grew in my career.
Yeah.
And so it was the people that really helped me get led. But obviously, as I got older and as I started being more curious, I got into a lot of podcasts and reading a lot of leadership books. And so that really propelled me to take more chances and take more risks as a leader.
Yeah, I love that, because I think a lot of times we do talk a lot about leadership principles, and principles are things that we can often learn in books or through podcasts or going to a conference, listening to even something like what we're doing in this series called Good Shepherding. But usually what precedes the leadership principles is a leadership person, right? And I remember when I was 16 years old and God was working in my heart, there were some young leaders, guys just a year or two older than me, that I wanted to be like them. And I remember there was one young man who was a couple years older than me, and I went up to him one time, and he gave me the best piece of leadership advice I've ever received. And I asked him, I said, how do I become a leader? That's a pretty big open-ended question. And what he said was, pray. Pray and ask God to make you a leader, and he will show you the opportunities when it comes. And it was almost like as soon as I started praying that prayer, leadership opportunities just started blooming up. And then when I became a youth pastor at a local church at 19 years old, my whole concept of leadership was my youth pastor. I didn't start with a book. I started with a person. And so as we think about today, this idea of leadership, we know that the way of the master, Jesus, was to pull in his apprentices.
That's
right? And that's always been the best way to learn how to become a leader and then to make leaders as well.
That's right.
King David was one of the greatest leaders in the history of the world, but before he became a king, he was a shepherd. Listen to this passage describing the way God chose David for leadership from Psalm chapter 78, 70 through 72. And it says, God chose David, his servant, and took him from the sheepfolds, from the care of the ewes with sucking lambs. He brought him to shepherd Jacob, his people, and Israel, his inheritance. So he shepherded them according to the integrity of his heart and guided them with his skillful hands. So how do you think David's experience as a shepherd of actual sheep prepared him for this role of being the king shepherd of all of Israel?
Yeah. It's a great example of David. David was not even on the qualifying bench to become the king of Israel. His dad, Jesse, didn't even consider him. And it was Samuel that eventually found him and knew that there was something in David. And so David was not qualified necessarily, but he was called. And I remember somebody once said that God does not, I remember somebody once said that God does not call the qualified, but that he qualifies the called.
That's good.
And so David was someone who was behind the scenes. He wasn't even looking to be a leader. But God called him and qualified him because God called him. And so if you are given the calling, if you're in a situation where you're called to lead, it is not for everybody. Leadership is a weighty task. It's a scary task. But if God has put you in the position, then he has qualified you. I'm learning that real time right now. And so, David is a great example of that. A quote-unquote unqualified individual who was called and became qualified. I think what we also see here, though, is that David was a fat follower of the shepherd. He was faithful, available, and teachable. He was faithful in the little things he was doing. And I believe it was Jesus who says that to whom much it is given, or something along those lines, to whom much is given, much is expected.
Right.
And so, if God can, if you can be faithful in these little things, then you are preparing yourself to be ready for greater things of responsibility. And I think we see David as a living example in how he demonstrated leadership behind the scenes to eventually be on the front lines of leading a nation.
Yeah, I love that idea that if you're feeling overwhelmed and under-equipped for the role of leadership, well, then you're ready to actually become a leader. Because, like you said, God doesn't call the qualified. He qualifies those whom he has called. And John Maxwell distinguishes two types of leaders: those who attract followers and those who attract leaders. I want us to think about the good shepherd, and I want us to think about how the good shepherd multiplies himself to multiply the impact. In other words, how do leaders raise up more leaders? This passage provides several important leadership principles which should guide our thinking about the type of leaders we want to be and the type of leaders we want to attract. So let's start with number one. When looking for a leader, look for one who is a servant of God and others. We've talked about this already in a few other sessions, but how important is servant leadership to you as a leader of leaders? In other words, now that you're in a leadership role and you're looking for other leaders to serve underneath you, why is it important to look for somebody who is a servant leader?
Yeah. I think a servant leader is someone who can also lead others. And so if my hope is to be a leader of leaders, then I have to be able to give my leaders a reproducible model on how they're going to lead others. But if I'm someone who is in a position that is in it just to be in it and not really motivated, then you will eventually weed out your leaders and only have a group of followers. And so I think it's mission critical that to be a leader of leaders, that you're giving your team a vision for where you're going and a roadmap on how you're doing it so that they can replicate it themselves, which is only going to create a pipeline of more leaders, of a leadership development. And, not everyone is born a leader. I don't know if anyone is born a leader. That would be what servant leadership is, that someone is a leader of leaders by not only retaining the leaders that they have, by giving strong vision and a roadmap of where they're going, but creating a reproducible model for how those leaders can develop new leaders. So an example would be, right now I'm leading a disciple-making track at our church that consists of 5 people. And actually all 4 out of the 5 are brand new to the church, but they've jumped in this year to spend 24 meetings with me throughout the year of studying theology, studying disciple-making material, studying scripture together, and we're working through the content to be able to make disciples of our own in our communities. But I've also invited these individuals to lead the track for next year. I told them already from day one, I don't plan to lead this track next year. I expect you to lead the track next year. And so now they've taken on the burden, but the calling to be able to potentially lead the track next year. And I've already given them the model for how to do it.
That's great, because I think power and responsibility can look very similar from the outside, but ultimately on the inside, they're very, very different. That to be a servant leader is to ultimately say, I'm willing to be responsible for a growing amount of this mission.
That's right.
And what you said to those leaders in that environment was ultimately, I'm going to serve you by pouring this knowledge and this time and this resource of investment in you, but I'm also going to be empowering you to then do it to others as well.
That's right.
And When I was leading another spiritual organization, part of our weekly routine was having to set up chairs every single week. We'd have anywhere from 50 to 200 people show up, and every week we needed someone to come and set up the chairs. And every once in a while, I'd have somebody kind of drift into our group and say, I want to be a leader. I want to be in charge of this. I want to be in charge of that. And I would just say, hey, why don't you show up on Sunday morning and help us to stack some chairs? Help us to put out some chairs. And to me, that was a litmus test.
Absolutely.
If they were willing to serve and to just be a part of the team, then they were trustworthy to be able to lead a team.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great illustration of what servant leadership looks like. The second marker when looking for a leader is to look for one who leads from a heart of integrity. Character and integrity form the foundation of trust in leadership. Have you ever experienced a leader who lacks integrity? At the moment that you begin to sense that their integrity is wanting, they have undermined their leadership. So how does it impact an organization when there is a leak in the integrity of the leader?
Yeah. Yep. I think open communication and honesty and transparency are all critical values for good leadership. Open communication, honesty, and transparency. And one of my old vice presidents from my corporate days had a term called radical candor. Just being radically candid, radically open and real, doing it at all costs so that trust does not get eroded.
Yeah.
And absolutely I have experienced where the integrity of individuals being tarnished because of their lack of candor and transparency, because they err on the side of discretion rather than maybe truth. And it unfortunately caused me to lose trust in their leadership, and not in their friendship, but in their leadership. And it's really sad sometimes, because leadership and friendship can be intertwined. And it should be intertwined. I would hope that I'm friends with my leaders. But in other respects, it's not intertwined. There should be a boundary where when somebody is not meeting the expectations of their leadership, things have to change. And you would hope that the friendship can still remain. So leadership is a very messy responsibility. It requires great. It's a weighty responsibility, and it can cost relationships.
I think sometimes when we think about integrity, we think that means somebody is either a liar or they're someone that tells the truth. But in many ways, integrity often comes down to do you do what you say you will do? Are you responsible? Can people depend on you? Can they trust your leadership? And we live in a culture that highly prizes talent and ability. And, I've had leaders over the years that, to be quite frank, I perhaps was mesmerized by their talent, by their potential. And yet, once I brought them onto the team, began to realize that their lack of integrity was a limiting factor. It was a lid to their ability to actually lead in the organization. They'd shine one moment and then they wouldn't show up the other moment. And so I think, what we're learning and what we want to be as we think about this good shepherding principle is, if you're a great shepherd, maybe you're an elite shepherd 85% of the time, but then 15% of the time, you just leave your sheep completely abandoned. ultimately someone's going to say, hey, we need to find a different shepherd because it's not acceptable
That's right.
to have a shepherd that we can't depend on. So I think just keeping that integrity, understanding in mind is critical when we're recruiting individuals for leadership roles. The third marker when looking for a leader is to look for one who is constantly seeking to improve his skills. I love this little aspect of the verse that we read earlier from Psalm. It says David grew in his skills. He grew in his skills as a musician. He grew in his skills as a slinger, which is how he took down the giant Goliath. His skills as a fighter were honed through personal growth and development. So as a leader, what steps are you personally taking to improve your own skills in whatever areas you deem necessary?
Yep. I, in my role as lead elder or lead pastor, there are 3 areas that I spend countless hours in terms of reading and listening. And those are my own preaching ability, emotional health, and leading organizations. And so all 3 of those categories, if you were to ask me what I spend my free time doing, it's basketball, boxing, and those 3 areas.
Okay.
Obviously my family, spend time with family.
Yes. But in terms of development.
In terms of development, yes. And it's very similar to boxing. When I first started boxing 3 years ago, my first day at the gym, I get on the jump rope and I start vomiting. I couldn't even jump rope at the pace they wanted me to.
Wow.
They asked me to do mitt work just to figure out my speed, and I threw up again. I threw up twice in an hour.
Wow.
Because I was just such a beginner. But now, 3 years later, I've honed in my skills. It's muscle memory. And in the same way, when I grew in my, I can say the same thing with my preaching. When I first started preaching, I didn't even know what I was doing when I was up there. But I've been able to hone it in by reading and listening to other great preachers and reading books on preaching and getting feedback from experienced preachers like yourself and also emotional health. I listen to Pete Scazzaro and John Mark Comer and read a lot of their books and materials and then in leadership, Craig Groeschel is a fantastic leader in the church space. Carrie Newhoff, Franklin Covey, who's more on the corporate side, is incredible. Patrick Lencioni, who's written a lot of books on organizational leadership. So I'm always reading and listening to hone in those skills. And I hope my hope is that I will never grow weary of doing that because as long as I'm human, there's always room to grow.
Right. Yeah. And you said this earlier, but leaders are readers, leaders are learners. If you're not pushing yourself forward to grow as a leader, how can you ever expect anyone else to do the same thing as well? So, when you think about looking for those next generation of leaders, I think certainly one thing you talked about, faithful, available, teachable, they're fat. And I think the other part of that is, are they hungry? So, if you can find a leader who's hungry and fat, he's going to make a large impact if you follow my drift. I look back on myself as a young leader, and I see this with you as well, should you. But I felt like, I didn't have elite skills or elite ability in a number of different areas, but I was hungry and I was faithful and available and teachable. And as a result, the skills grew, but people opened the door for someone who's hungry and wants to learn, wants to grow. And so I think, guys, that's where you're at. If you're a young leader who's participating in this study, stay hungry, keep growing, keep pursuing. If you're an older leader, look for those leaders that are hungry, they're faithful, available, teachable. Those are the guys that are really going to make the biggest impact over the long haul. Mm-hmm. When seeking potential leaders, let me see. We might want to skip over that. Yeah, that's good. So we talked about that distinction that John Maxwell makes between attracting followers and raising up leaders. Yeah. Gaining followers can happen fairly quickly, especially if you are charismatic or particularly skilled. But multiplying leaders requires an investment. How do you structure your time and your schedule to personally invest in your own leadership and in the leadership of others? And you kind of already mentioned this a little bit with that discipleship track. Mm-hmm. Somebody might say, is that a waste of time to spend 24 sessions with only 5 people? Couldn't you do more if you had 50 or 100? But why does that method work?
Yeah. I learned from Pete Scazzero, who is famous for the Emotionally Healthy series, that he calls it basement work. And this is true because his church was in New York City, and him and his wife would devote their basement to just a few people that they would invest in and week out. And that led into a church flooding with leaders, not just with the potential to lead, but they were high quality leaders. They had within them the Bible knowledge. They had within them the training. They were able to observe their teacher, their leader, Pete and his wife. And so in the same way, I am committed to doing that. I'm not a Pete Scazzero by any means, but I'm willing to make the time in the role that I'm in to teach what I have to offer and rely on the resources of others. And so that's what we've been doing. We're doing life together for 24 sessions. And another thing that we do at the church is called the Elder Discernment Track, where we take 3, this year we had 3, next year we'll hopefully have about 5 or 6 men to go through exploring the possibility of becoming an elder. And that's an 8-month journey. Yeah. Where we're doing the similar things to the disciple-making track. We're reading Scripture, studying Scripture, not just reading, studying, examining it. We're reading tons and tons of content, listening to a lot of podcasts, and we're just together wrestling about the possibility of what would it look like for you to become an elder. And we also hear from our active elders, like you've sat in, and we've interviewed you and the other elders as well. And to me, that is real discipleship, basement work, where I'm able to pour into leaders so that they can then pour into the next generation and those leaders from among us. And then to me, the outcome, the final product that we'll see is that we'll have a church of high quality leaders that are positioned to make an impact in our community, as opposed to just showing up to church, living maybe a shallow life with shallow relationships, focusing on their own individual kingdoms for their careers, but as opposed to, as a church family, we're working together for the gospel in every way.
Yeah, it's great. Jesus, of course, was the ultimate example of all that. He preached to the thousands. He healed hundreds. Yeah. He had a core group of 120, but he really invested in 12. And he did that in such a way that when he ended his ministry and ascended into heaven, those 12 changed the world. And I think that's a great model for us. And it really leans in well to our ABC Bible study method passage for this week, which is 2 Timothy chapter 2. Take time to read this really awesome chapter that is the conversation between a senior leader and a junior leader, Paul and Timothy, and come prepared to share your best verse from that chapter. And then our scripture memory verse is really the game plan. It's the It's the play to run if you want to multiply your impact. And it's found in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2. The things which you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust these things to faithful people who will be able to teach others also. As we conclude this series on leadership, remember the heart of the Good Shepherd in Psalm 23. God's heart is always for us to be close to Him, to know and trust Him, and to follow His loving lead. He desires to restore our souls and lead us in paths of righteousness for His name's sake. As we strive to become a leader like the Good Shepherd, we should always remember that the people whom God has entrusted to us are far more valuable than our goals, our vision, or results. May we care more about the well-being of our flock than how fast, how far, or how high we can take them. Guys, thank you so much for being a part of this study called Good Shepherding. We hope that you will love your Good Shepherd more deeply, and you will be like the Good Shepherd more consistently as you walk these things out in fellowship with other men, as you lead your wives, your children, your family, and your community. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Shiju. And we'll see you for our next Impact Cohort study.